Fantastic to have you with us for this webinar, Sustainable Cork Programme webinar series. And today is all about Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, which I'm sure some of us I'm sure know a lot about, certainly our speakers today. And thank you to our three speakers who will be introduced a little bit later on by Ashley. I'm certainly looking forward to understanding much more about CSRD. It is going to have a very significant impact across all business over the next period of time. So it's great on this webinar today to be getting to the bottom of that a little bit. The webinar series, we're delighted to have our sponsors and our partners, Cork Chamber Skillnet, and also ESB Generation and Trading, and welcome to those from both organizations who are on the webinar here again today. A little bit of housekeeping. Ask everyone to keep the mics off if you could, please. You would have seen as you came in there as well, we are recording just for our own records, if that's okay. You can use the chat box in terms of Q&A and anything that pops into your mind as the speakers go through their presentations. Please do so, and we'll do our best to deal with those towards the end. And as you know, you have the choice of having camera on or camera off. I find it could be good if people can see others on the call as well. That can be very useful. And obviously, in terms of viewing, you can view in gallery or speaker view, whichever is your choice as well. Maybe a little bit of background for maybe some of those newer to this program or to the webinar series. The Sustainable Cork program actually kicked off in the Chamber back in the bad days of the pandemic in May 2020. We were looking to see how do we look to the future, and and look towards Cork as a more sustainable and resilient economy. And it proved hugely successful with fantastic buy-in from both business, our members, and the wider community. And we produced a report at the time on building economic resilience. And one of the things that came out of that was a real appetite actually for this type of webinar series, looking at all things related to sustainability. So we've covered areas like Cork City revitalization, electric mobility, energy cost savings, and so on. And we're going to continue this program out into the future because it's a really good, useful way of getting really valuable information, content, discussion in a format which is very straightforward online, like we are here today. So look, it's great to have you all with us. As I said, again, thanks to both our speakers and our sponsors. With that, I'll hand over to my colleague Ashley, who will take it over from here. Ashley, there you go.
Thanks very much, Connor. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashley Amato. I work in Public Affairs and Sustainability at Cork Chamber, and I'm really excited to be here with you all this morning for this really important and timely webinar on the new game-changing regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Now, as Connor said, some of you may already be familiar with reporting, whether that's through the non-financial reporting directive. Some of you may be voluntarily reporting, and others may be completely new to the ESG reporting game. Either which way, this directive represents a massive transformation in corporate reporting, bringing lots of challenges for businesses, but also great opportunities for Irish companies to gain a competitive advantage. This directive will play a key role in our transition to a sustainable economy and in meeting our climate targets. And it also brings into play this unique principle referred to as double materiality that brings a new holistic approach to data and ESG reporting, meaning companies will have to disclose both the risks that they face regarding climate and ESG matters, and also their impact on both people and planet. Now, these new regulations will require companies in scope to report on sustainability information across all three ESG topics, including biodiversity, climate goals, and human rights, alongside financial information in directors' reports. It will be introduced in a phased-in approach up until 2026, applying to companies with more than 500 employees starting in 2024, companies with more than 250 employees starting in 2025, and SMEs by 2026. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our expert speakers who have joined us here this morning. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. So please use the chat box throughout the session, and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So first up, I'm really happy to introduce Matt Evans with 91. Matt is a global investment manager based in London, and his goal is to provide long-term investment return for clients while making a positive difference for people and the planet. So Matt, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be with you in Cork. Sadly, I'm stuck in London where it's been pretty grey and miserable today. So we're actually been sitting in rain. So yeah, I came over to Cork a month or so ago with the Chamber to present at another presentation there. And I was really quite encouraged by some of the conversations we had and about the progress that many companies seem to be making. As Ashley has mentioned, I'm an institutional investor. We look at global companies. I'm particularly focused on UK equities, and regulation is playing a huge part as well in many of the things that we're having to consider as investors. At 91, I'm part of a sustainable equity team. So we have a fundamental belief that companies now, it's really important that they can deliver good financial returns, but not at the expense of all stakeholders. And there really has been a significant shift, we think, in how companies are reacting, but how consumers are engaging with companies as well, and how businesses want their suppliers to also behave. So we're very much focused on that as an investment philosophy, really, that if companies can understand that relationship with all their stakeholders, they will be best placed in the future to generate strong financial returns, but also to contribute more positively to the world around them. So as an investor, that creates some tools. So we're looking at this at a basis of investment approach rather than just dealing with regulation. And I think regulation is important and playing a role. That's one of the reasons you're here today. But if it can feel really embedded within your business and you can understand it from your own perspective and be self-aware about what the elements of your business are and how they can make a material impact with those stakeholders in the world around you, actually that can come across to your customers, be a competitive advantage. And then for those of you that are still requiring finance or investment, actually that can be a real positive to the investment community as well. So we have developed what we consider investment tools really to try and understand that approach, because it addresses both risk and opportunity. And I'm very much take an approach that I look at companies on an internal sustainability basis, how you would all make the most efficient use of all your resources and key stakeholders. And we use this externalities framework, which addresses natural, social, and human capital. And as an example, natural capital would be about your carbon reporting. That's an easier place to start these days because there's a very clear framework of how you should report on that basis for a scope 1, 2, and 3 basis. But water, again, could be challenging. What about waste? But biodiversity, areas like that, we know are more challenging to have a very consistent approach to how you would report on that. But actually, companies that understand that have a self-awareness about how their operations can impact biodiversity. We think it's really encouraging that companies begin to talk and report on those bases until a more standardized methodology comes through, because it helps us understand the risk within that business model. We replicate that in social capital, which is very much about how you look after stakeholders, whether it's in the local community and all your key sort of supplier relationships. And then human capital we would have as managing your own internal people, really, your employees, what's the culture of your business, what's your training schedules look like, and those kind of areas. And I think this is key for us to really understand the potential risk within a business and to understand how you make the best and most efficient use of your resources. And again, we're looking to engage with companies and understand what's most material for you. So the regulation can be quite set and stringent, but actually as an investor, we're looking really to understand those areas of materiality. So we actually don't look at many of the rating agencies that we would consider that ask this sort of regulatory approach to reporting, but try and understand it from a company's perspective. And I would still say that's a good starting point really for all businesses to think about it, because it is hard to report. It requires resources, etc. Not every company has the resources to do that. But if you can report on the areas of greatest materiality for yourself, we think that sets you in a very good position. So this is a bit more detail. I'm not going to dwell on this slide about the details we'll go into about the capitals. Other to say, not only do we look at the internal sustainability, how you report on your own operations, but we really believe that actually you can deliver products and services that can really drive your medium and longer term structural growth. So that is in our sustainability opportunities function. Are you delivering products and services that can contribute towards solutions to some of the global challenges? And within that, again, we're very focused on the intentionality of those products, trying to differentiate between that are investing in growth areas to drive products or solutions that can help them grow into the future. We've got to be able to measure that, and is it material for your particular business and how you're operating. Again, this is an area that we think is slightly outside of some of the core regulations, but we think is a really interesting area to understand and be able to present to your range of stakeholders about how you can contribute maybe products and services that can help them address some of their sustainability and maybe regulatory issues as well. Again, we think within that, it's important to have tools. As investors, we're being challenged by regulators as well about reporting consistently about how our funds are structured, how we're measuring areas of E, S, and G. So if you can have tools and then you can present that clearly and consistently, then that lends you into a really much stronger position, not just relying on some of the rating agencies and those tick boxes. And when we engage with companies, that's actually a pretty critical part for us as well, how we encourage those companies to think about it from their perspective, how it impacts their business, how intentional it is and important it is to the fundamental operations of your company, not just addressing the tick box exercise that some of the regulation is about. So that's one of the areas we kind of encourage the companies we invest in to really think about, because it can help stand the company out as an investment. They really understand those areas of material risk and opportunity, but also over time that will address the main concerns of the regulator, because it's all about understanding really materiality. Where are your biggest risks and where are those biggest opportunities? So I hope that's given you a bit of an insight from an institutional investor's point of view, how we're considering these areas of risk and regulation within our own business, but how we try and understand and be pragmatic about the pressures it can put on companies as well. We absolutely believe in the importance of addressing, sustainable concerns, but encouraging companies to think about it from their perspective first. You will know your business better than a regulator or an investor, so be confident on putting that best and front foot forward first, being open that you might have areas of challenge or particular risk, and that actually stands you in a much better stead than just trying to cover off all areas and just get the boxes ticked. So we would absolutely encourage that detailed sort of fundamental approach and being very consistent and sort of open and transparent about your areas of risk and where you're able to address those concerns immediately and those areas that might take longer to address. So I'm going to pause there, stop sharing, and then hopefully be around to answer any questions later on.
That was great. Thanks so much for that, Matt. You really kind of set the scene there in terms of the opportunities for businesses to get started on this in a way that they really understanding the material aspects of their business and going forward with reporting in a way that is beyond just complying. So now I'm excited to introduce our next speaker for this morning. We have Laura Morrison joining us. Laura is a sustainability advisor and Munster Network lead with Business in the Community Ireland. Laura supports and advises companies across a range of governance and social inclusion topics, including this corporate sustainability reporting directive. So Laura, the floor is yours.
All right. So yeah, thanks, Ashley, and thanks, Matt, for your comments. I think everything there, I think, dovetails very much with what I'm going to talk about, but I'll be taking a slightly different tack through this. So, as Ashley says, my name's Laura Morrison. I work for business in the Community Ireland. We're a membership-based network. We've around 120 of Ireland's biggest companies as members. And a lot of what we do is supporting them in different ways to embed sustainable practices throughout their organizations. I would say, as much as CSRD is huge and it is daunting, it provides a catalyst for fully embedding sustainability in organizations that we just really haven't had before. So for us, from our point of view, and what this is opening up with members for us, it's also pretty exciting. The priority for a lot of our members over the last few months, been waiting for the regulations and the standards to mature and to come through in their second iteration, has been really convincing their CEOs and their leadership teams that this is a game-changing directive and that it needs focused attention. And I think that's really the first key message here, that for companies to be able to comply with CSRD, it really does need very strong top-down support. The major organizational implication that CSRD should trigger is that sustainability stops being an organizational silo. It stops being just one person's job. So yes, there will still be sustainability managers and their teams, but the ethos of CSRD is really that sustainability becomes fully woven through an organization. And if you think of it like finance or like HSE are now, there might be leads for it, but their jobs are really to create the policies, set the targets, provide expertise, provide frameworks. But the whole organization has to be literate in these kinds of areas, and everyone, whatever their role is, has some kind of accountability for delivery. And I think that's where some companies have been going with sustainability and where this is now kind of driving them to go further. Another reason why senior leaders need to care about CSRD is that it aims to make sustainability reporting equal with financial reporting. So that means that leadership needs to scrutinize and sign off on the reports with the same level of confidence they do with financial reports. They need to own this. So from the overarching sustainability narrative to the skills and expertise in their own leadership team to different performance metrics, they're going to need to know all this and be able to stand over it when it's published kind of year on year. So look, there's questions that we'd put to CEOs and leaders of reporting companies at this stage, and they would be, for example, what are your personal knowledge gaps around CSRD and how will you fill them? Who's on your internal steering committee or your project team for CSRD, because you need one. And it should probably include legal, finance, risk, audit, as well as sustainability and potentially others as well. What's your own level of sustainability ambition and how are you going to drive it on using CSRD? Because this is really a wasted opportunity if you just see it as a compliance exercise. I mean, the whole thing is a big market signal about what investors are going to be looking for in the future, as Matt said, and I think it's about finding your own sweet spots and your own priorities and using this as a framework to drive them on. What kind of, sorry, back to that last slide. What kind of resourcing and upskilling is your company going to need? Because there is a huge amount of work involved. And then allied to that, what balance do you want between ownership and outsourcing? Do you upskill early? Do you do a lot in-house? Or are you comfortable from the outset with quite a lot of third-party involvement? I'll touch briefly on gap assessments. It's something that came up in conversation with Ashley, and I think that's one of the key steps after getting that top level leadership buy-in. So our advice, if you're doing a CSRD gap assessment in-house, would be to really set it up again as a project. You're going to need to allocate your topics out by function or by sub-function. Again, it's something that you can't expect one person or one small team to be doing. You're going to need each function looking in detail at what you're currently doing compared to what you're going to be asked to report on. And there are different kinds of gap that you're going to need to look for. So You'll need your baseline data, you'll need your annual data, and ultimately you'll also need your value chain data. You need to remember as well that you need management systems for each topic area. So you're not just looking at floating data and floating metrics. Every topic within the CSRD needs to be managed systematically through having a strategy, policies, plans, metrics, etc. So like, if that's not how you currently structure things consistently at the moment, or if what you call your documents and your processes don't sound like that, there's a reconciliation exercise that you're going to need to do there. I think also remember that your reported data is going to need to be independently assured, and eventually down the line it's going to need to be audited. So it's not just about pulling your figures from somewhere, it's about knowing what your source documentation is and it can be verified. You may have seen earlier in June some amendments came in from the EU Commission. The upshot of them really is that you have more time to do a lot of this planning and preparation. So stagger how you're planning to close the gaps that you come up with through your assessment. Be looking towards a kind of a multi-year roadmap now, rather than what could have been actually quite a frantic change project for reporting companies. Now, I think having seen the attendees list and having seen you come into the room, a lot of you are probably here not because you're reporting anytime soon, but because you're in the supply chain of companies who are. So a few points, I think, around that. We can just pop onto the next slide. And I'll leave that up for until the end, because I think we're still kind of absorbing what it is we're actually talking about. So let's just leave the standards up there, and as we talk, you can kind of apply that to the points. So look, what do the standards and directives say about the value chain? Well, each of these cross-cutting standards apply both to a company's own operations and to its value chain. So for each one of these topics and then the subtopics within them, reporting companies need to be thinking about the relevant issues as they occur in their value chain. The concept of a value chain is not precisely defined in the standards, so there is room for a company to make its own reasonable definition, but we know that it should be looking at upstream and downstream, and it should be looking at direct and indirect relationships, so not just where you hold a direct contract. We know that reporting companies don't need to report on every single actor in their value chain, so some slight relief there. They do need to be able to describe their value chain in framing their reporting in a way that shows that they've got full awareness and full visibility, but the reporting comes when it is a specific matter of material impact, risk, or opportunity. Going back to what Matt was saying, we're seeing a lot of companies now starting mapping exercises of their value chains as a precursor to then looking at where and how they're going to need to start collecting data. There's a bit of leeway around it. These changes that came in a couple of weeks ago mean that companies only have to make reasonable efforts to get value chain data for the first 3 reporting years, but they do need a plan to get the full data eventually. That's likely to mean that they're going to be trying to use or increase the leverage that they have with you as suppliers. So what you might be starting to experience is, for example, new contractual requirements or tendering criteria around providing data. Potentially also reporting companies cascading their requirements. So they might begin to be asking you as a supplier to gather data at layers below you and then be funneling that back up. Now, practical things that you as an SME supplier can start thinking about in preparation. I'd say definitely, absolutely having a handle on your scopes 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions and your active plans to reduce them. Look at how you can enhance traceability of your own products, and look at preemptively doing your own due diligence around any particular sensitivities that you have, because it's these things that are going to have to be reported on where there is an impact, where there is a risk. And these are most likely based around either the nature of an activity or its geography. So when you're extracting raw materials, when you're having an activity that's very water intensive, when your inputs are very climate vulnerable, where you're sourcing from a country that has weaker human rights or corruption protections, for example. Look, I would say as much as all these preparatory steps are going to help. The absolutely key thing in a value chain is going to be dialogue and engagement. And going back to address the larger companies, there's a lot that you can do here to help suppliers. The resources that you're going to be putting into CSRD are far more than your smaller companies can be expending to understand this, to interpret it, to figure out what's actually going to be needed and why, and then to help them upskill to be able to fulfill the value chain requirements. So we've seen some quite nice examples already recently among our members of mentoring and capacity building through their supply chain, particularly around carbon. It's a technical area where support is always really, really appreciated. I would say as well, ideally, sector leading companies would be talking to each other to cross-reference how they're interpreting the standards and the requirements, and to try to bring some consistency into what they're going to be asking their suppliers and how they're going to be asking that. And for supplier companies, message back where you need support and extra capacity. The final point, Ashley, that you asked me to look at was opportunities. And I don't know if I'm going to disappoint you slightly, I think, because I would say, coming from a point of view of an organization that is very focused on sustainability, ultimately these changes for now are about driving a necessary new way of thinking about business. I think the time when standards and certifications could really stand out as a market differentiator has kind of passed for now, just because the compliance bar has risen so much, and because so many companies do have to be on board either mandatorily now or voluntarily. What will change, so the first few years of this, I think, looking at the real, as it being a big commercial bounce, it's probably not going to happen. I think the way this is supposed to work, obviously, is that over a period of a few years, CSRD does become really established. If it's used as intended, it is going to be the standard for investment decision making, and it's going to be the standard for benchmarking companies against each other. So again, it's about leveraging this framework to think, in what areas do you want to stand out? Do you want to stand out in comparison with your peers within your sector? How do you push towards that? And then that will come out through this tool as it develops and evolves over time. And then just for smaller companies, again, I'd say your opportunity might come from working out what you can feasibly ask your customers to support in the interests of shared value, because innovation or upgrade in favour of sustainability, it is an investment in this environment, and CSRD gives you a framework to be broaching that through your value chain. But for everyone, you're going to be evolving hopefully into much more sustainability literate organizations, identifying your lateral connections, understanding yourselves better. And if you build more resilient business models as a result of this, if you get to know and manage your value chain better, then given how fast climate change is happening, given all the other disruptors that are being thrown at us at the moment, there's got to be inherent value in that. So that's it from me. I think there's a few key summaries on the next slide, but we can whip through them. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Laura. There was so much in that, lots of practical steps, and what I was hearing a lot of as well was like data, the need for dialogue and engagement, stakeholder engagement. And as well, I think we're all learning or realizing this is going to be a real learning experience over the next number of years. So now I am happy to introduce our final speaker for this morning's webinar. We were expected to be joined by Lorraine McCann from EY, but due to some unforeseen circumstances, Lorraine was not able to make it, but we are really, really happy to have Derica Dennis joining us. Derica is partner and leader of climate change and sustainability services at EY. She brings over 20 years experience in financial and non-financial reporting. So really happy that Derica was able to join us last minute like this today. So over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be joining you this morning. My two previous speakers have shared an awful lot in terms of CSRD, and there are a lot of people who are already kind of going a part way through this journey. So I think it is a journey that, it takes a bit of time, but it is one that I think does bring its fruits and opportunities. We've just seen earlier on just what this looks like. Laura shared kind of the standards themselves. I think what I would say about the standards is, yeah, it is regulation. Matt referred to regulation, not necessarily giving all the insight, but this is quite a different set of standards, because what they do is they actually do acknowledge if something's not material to an organization, you don't have to respond to all the disclosures. It's very clearly set out that this is something to be thought through. The double materiality exercise that was referred to earlier on, that is actually an exercise that allows you to look at what's important to you and to your stakeholders. And there's a very wide analysis that also takes into account the financial impacts. So I think that acknowledgement is really, really important, because it allows companies, as they're thinking about preparing for this, to do their gap analysis, as Laura correctly says, is an important thing to do and needs to be structured in a way that works for all. But I think, honestly, this standard is not about trying to catch people out. It's about sharing information and being transparent, or I suppose a suite of standards. So, at the moment, we already have published the cross-cutting standards, as Laura correctly mentioned, but, not all of those will have a high impact on all of you. And I think the E side of the house, if you look at the top of the sector, on the environmental side, there's some that people will have already addressed, particularly in the climate change space. But I am personally really, really pleased to see it's wider than just climate. It's, there's a bigger issue here. So we have water, we have pollution, biodiversity, we have communities, and as Laura has alluded to there, the supply chain, the value chain, really important. So I think there's an awful lot of challenges in maybe pulling it into place. But when you actually have it in place, it would tell your story in a way that's really important for your organization. And there is, other standards coming that would be sector specific. So if you are in a particular sector, I suppose you watch out for that. There's also an acknowledgement that it's going to be small and medium-sized entities, proportionate standards. So if you are a small organization, or if you're working with a smaller organization, there is a phasing in of the standards. So, the initial disclosures will be required for those who are applying the NF4D currently, and then large companies will come in 2025, and then later on you have other organizations. So there is an acknowledgement that this is something that will evolve and change, but for people who come kind of from the smaller business community, there will be a smaller set of standards that will encapsulate much of what's in today's standards. So I'd certainly be having a little look at them and thinking about how they might affect you. But there will be accommodations, no doubt. And then the third group that will come in is the third country company standards. So they're going to be for companies. Many companies in Ireland are actually part of a larger ecosystem, maybe a US parent or a UK parent or a Swiss parent. And they are what are in the third country community. And they actually will have standards that will pull them through and pull them in. So I do have a number of clients trying to think, well, what do I need to do? Because actually my parent is actually not an Irish parent and not a European country. How do I deal with that? So there are kind of accommodations and considerations that are quite different for that group of people. And we have a massive FDI community in Ireland. So I know many of you today listening would be thinking, oh, I'm one of them. So you are. So it's not that you can ignore the standards, because as Laura correctly says, you're going to be in the supply chain for many organizations who will require information because they're caught by the standards. So if you're all sitting there having a cup of tea, quite relaxed, there may be things that come at you, even though you're not required to report. But, as I say, I think on the whole, the premise of these standards is, as Matt says, to help investors, help wider stakeholder community. That's what these standards are trying to do as well. While it is regulationally driven, it is actually having the same desired outcome as many of the investor community currently. So I'm quite excited about what that looks like personally. Talking to a lot of clients and talking to people who are thinking about this at the moment, there are obviously challenges that we're seeing across the globe and in countries. So the double materiality, how does it work? How should you apply it? We're very familiar with the single materiality, where we're looking at the stakeholder community in the broader sense. The double materiality brings in the financial impact. So there is a challenge, because that's not something maybe people who sit in sustainability are used to doing. And that calls, as Laura said and Matt said, that cross collaboration across the organization, finance and non-finance, to work together. Another big challenge for many people that we chat to is the reporting structure. So how do you define your CSRD report? What does that look like? So if you have an American parent, do you do what we call an artificial consolidation of your European entities, or do you do entity by entity reporting? They're choices you need to make. An artificial consolidation sounds like an easier route from some, but for others it may not be. So there is thinking about how you would like to do it as an organization, and what's most appropriate with regard to resources and ability. And just, everyone has many projects ongoing in the organization. So there is a bit of like, what do you need to do and what wave are you caught in? So really important just to think about that. The other thing is really interesting one is actually, for those who do currently have a sustainability report of some form, that's typically quite a bit after the annual report or the financial information being shared. these two reports are actually going to be contemporaneously shared. So for many, that means just changing the processes and the structure and the timing of information gathering. So again, it seems like a simple question, say, oh, you just put them in together. But actually, if you're used to reporting your sustainability report in July and you do your kind of financial information in March, 4 months is a long time. So that's just something to think about. How do you gather it? How do you make sure everybody's on board, and consistency of data and information and comparability? So quite an interesting space. Data. There's 1,400 data points that come out of the disclosures as they currently sit. That's massive. Actually referred to it earlier on. It's just it's something that I think cannot be underestimated. And while you might have time, I think it's also an opportunity, because the data that sits in your organization is gold. Let's be frank. It gives you insight as to what your consumers are thinking about, what your supply chain looks like. So there is an opportunity to try and structure data in a new way that supports not just this reporting agenda, but supports other agendas across the organization. So for many, when I go in and I chat to them, they say, well, we have multiple ERP systems. We have another system for sustainability reporting that's for kind of an EHS agenda. And they have many different avenues to gather the information. Well, this is a real opportunity to sit back and say, okay, how do we deal with this? Where does everything sit? And how can I collate it in a way that makes sense, and that I'm not having to go back for different things all the time? You can apply things like Alteryx or Power BI and create reports. You don't have to spend millions to create reports. You actually just have to think cleverly about what data you need and how you use it. So I think it's really important to spend a little bit of time to understand the processes that sit behind the business and how they work and what interfaces they have in terms of commercial decisions, finance decisions, sustainability decisions, and make sure that you have everybody in that conversation. Because if you're going to make a change or you're going to invest in something, let's make sure it's useful for many parties. The one thing that is probably a little bit of a challenge is, at the moment, sustainability reporting is typically voluntary in Ireland. So therefore, there aren't necessary processes and controls that are, I suppose, subject to particular due diligence or assurance. So for many, there may be processes that are understood because it's been done by a person in the organization for a period, or that you just have an established routine. But now what's happening is these processes need to be linked into policies and into a reporting structure. And bringing that to the level of kind of the equivalent of financial reporting is quite a journey. And for many who work in the sustainability space, it's not something they've ever done. So I would say that's just something to take a bit of time to think about it, and to make sure that, in the various different parts of your business, that there's consistency. So you're not having to kind of sense check things in 3 different ways, because actually there's 3 different preferences in your group or your group of companies. So there's a little bit of just thinking around that. And upfront planning and thinking about the kind of the consequences, I think, makes a huge difference. And the last piece that many people that I chat to are quite worried about is that assurance piece. Like, what does that look like? What will I do? Will my current auditor, if you're subject to audit, will they be able to do it? But these are all things that the regulators in Ireland are thinking about. And I think the answer to that is yes. But the question is, will they have the skill set to do the assurance? So there's just a little bit of conversation going on around how do we do it, and where does this kind of expertise and knowledge skill sets come from. But the reasonable assurance is a long way off. Okay, there is a consensus that reasonable assurance, which relies on your controls and processes, which is kind of equivalent to financial reporting. At the moment, there is a consensus that is quite a high bar, and I think there will be a kind of extra time given. But the limited assurance is going to come in, immediately. So you will have it a lower level of assurance given on how you report. So it is important to get it right. But then, as Laura correctly says, this is a multi-year program. This is something you need to think about. But you need to try to sit down now and think about when you're impacted, how you're impacted, and how your supply chain is impacted, because you may be asked information of somebody you're providing a service to before you have to comply yourself. So there are a lot of challenges, but with those challenges, there's always opportunities. There's always an opportunity to do something better or streamline or collaborate. So I think it's a great time, but it's important just to kind of sit back and reflect on what are the key priorities for your organization and how any of these projects can be aligned with this project. And just, thinking about the target operating model, because that's another question everyone says to me, well, who does what? How does this work? And so there's probably a few things to think about. And I suppose one of them is, the policies. So you have some policies with regard to what you do from a sustainability perspective, but it's going to be much wider. You probably have HR policies in place already. You certainly have your environmental health and safety ones, but you may not have ones that go down to the level of water or pollution or circular economy. So to document your policies, make sure they're relevant, and make sure you have they're understood and applied across the business. So that's one that is something that you can do at any stage. And I think doing it earlier and understanding the asks of it earlier is not a bad idea. another thing, resources, the organization. I don't have the money to, take on 5 extra people to do this job. How do I get there? So I always find when I'm working with clients that somebody who's in the background doing a diploma or a master's in sustainability, you'd be surprised now when you look through your organization that somebody has an interest. So I suppose it is thinking about, well, initially, in-house, how to do a preliminary analysis, or you may seek to have a third party provider support you. But then you need to think about what's the ideal structure that isn't disruptive to your business, and how you might wish to invest going forward. So there is things that understand the new activities, what teams are currently involved in some of the sub-process, and seeing how you can align that together. But invariably, you are looking at probably bringing somebody in, maybe to the finance team or somebody from the finance team and sustainability team, to work together and create this kind of fused thinking for finance and non-finance, that everyone can work collaboratively. So I think that is the real challenge. The data, I suppose, the data point I made earlier on, quality of data, accessibility of data is a real challenge. So what does it look like in the structuring of that? So I think it's very important to make sure that you can get to a point of understanding one version of data. And that is a really important feature of this particular reporting. And I suppose the management reports as well need to be aligned. So how do you think about that too? So there's probably a little bit of there to think about. People are core to everything that any organization does, technology and people. I think it's probably fair to say that lots of organizations may have people who are very skilled from a sustainability perspective and an environmental perspective, but don't necessarily have a full suite of competencies. So it is important to understand what's material to you, back to Matt's point earlier on, and make sure you can tell that story, because that's what you'll be reporting on as well. There's a plethora of programs out there for employees for training. The business in the community have a program, you have it here in the Cork Chamber. So I wouldn't be afraid that there aren't training programs. It's just identify the right one for you and your organization, and make sure that you maybe have a program of thinking about who should be going on this, and the timing of that, because you won't be able to probably have everyone do it at the same time. Another aspect that I think would be quite important to think about is the performance measurement. How do you have obviously the CSRD reporting, but there's probably sub elements there that might be impacted. So I'd certainly encourage you to think about that, and how do you measure it? What's the cadence of measurement? What are the things that you may need to? It's an annual report, the CSRD. I don't think you want to leave it to be an annual event. So there's a little bit of thinking about that. One question we get asked quite often is, should the measurements be done on kind of an entity level, a divisional level, or a consolidated level? So just thinking about that. I suppose the last point that I'd love to make is, about technology and, how much you want to automate. I would always say, people start off and say, I'm going to do this beautiful Excel, and I say, that's great. But you do realize there's 1,400 data points, and there's 82 disclosures that include narrative and quantitative numbers. So think about where you might want to land. There's plenty of, I suppose, packages that are coming out that might be helpful. You might want to go there in the first instance. You may want to collect data in a more manual fashion, but I would encourage everyone on this call to start thinking about what packages are out there, what's suitable to your environment, whether the current sustainability package you have actually has a reporting element. It may well have, whether the ERP system you're using has sustainability. So there's lots of things to think about, but really important to start thinking about that and the governance around the reporting and the information and the data. So it's a very complex area, but lots to think about. But if you break it down, I say it's bite-sized chunks. I think that is probably the best way to start. And it does tell your story. Back to Matt's point, it's about telling what you do and how your business operates and how it is doing the right thing, and maybe focusing on the objectives over time. But look, I'm conscious that we also want to do a Q&A, so I'm going to hand back over to Ashley, but hopefully that will give you some food for thought. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jerica. A lot in that as well. And I really like that concept that you brought up, and it's kind of been brought up throughout all of these talks, that it's really could be used as a tool to share companies' journeys along as they move towards more sustainable practices. So now, conscious of time as well, and I'd really like to get started on some Q&A. So one of our first questions we have here is regarding the materiality assessments. And in undertaking those, are there any standards out there now that companies can use to start assessing their that materiality assessment? Maybe this is one for Laura, if you feel comfortable taking that.
Yeah, and I think the question referred to GRI particularly.
Yes.
So yeah, coming in from this double materiality perspective, which means on the one hand, you're looking at your classic materiality, which is financial. On the other hand, you're looking at impact materiality, which is about the externalities of what you're doing as they play out in the outside world. So GRI for that would give some guidance. It would give some guidance around topics. It would give some guidance around potential thresholds, for example, in terms of how you want to structure your materiality assessments. The accounting standards would be the ones to go to for financial materiality still. But marrying the two together, I think the actual double materiality as a discipline and as an exercise, something that not many companies have done or done well up to this point. We are seeing a few more examples coming through. It's something that is going to mature, and the guidance will mature and practice will mature, and there'll be a lot of kind of cross-learning and cross-referencing, as there will with so much in this area. But yeah, look at the GRI standards for impact. Look at the Italian energy company, Enel. They've done double materiality really nicely for a good few years. And Julia Genuardi, who is their manager for that, has been on the EFRAG developing the standards for CSRD as well. So I think, you know, she'll have brought some of that practice with her. SSE did a sustainability report. It was out a couple of weeks ago. They had a nice approach as well, if you want to look for an Irish peer company in this area. And I think they put out kind of a guidance sheet as well on sort of on how they'd done it and what they were looking for. So yeah, it's, you know, everyone's thinking about double materiality at the moment, and it will become clearer over time for sure.
Great, thanks, Laura. I see there's another question here, but I think you might have answered it already, Derica, on how to meet these reporting needs if you don't have the internal human resources. You touched on, you know, upskilling, looking at different programs and everything. So moving on to another question, I think maybe one for you, Derica, on data. You mentioned a lot about data. And I think there's like a big change coming with this directive is that the digitalization of these processes of sustainability data. How can companies go forward with this process of digitalizing their sustainability data?
Yeah, so I suppose that's a great question. I suppose what people are doing in practice in the first instance is trying to figure out what data they actually hold and what data they don't have. So that data gap analysis, not just the reporting, but the data gaps themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we are seeing in practice is that quite often if you have multiple divisional or multi-entity kind of organizations, that you may have people keeping data in slightly different structures. So the first thing is kind of a cleansing of the data, and then trying to work through, you know, the consistency and the formatting, etc. And, you know, in the simple, for small organizations, what they're doing is they're creating a bridge. They're using, you know, kind of a database structuring by the various standards. And this is done already for the GRI reporting. So it's the same kind of concept of using a database. If you're not using a formal program, and structuring the data platform in such a way that you can pull it through and that you can cut it by the different lenses that you may need. In practice, though, what's also happening now is you'll see all the software providers across the globe I was up with a session this morning at 7 o'clock on one particular one where they were doing kind of insights, and just upping their game and having much more accessible programs that are, you know, at a better price point for people across the business. So I think it's one thing I would say is, you take the data is to cleanse it first, look it through, but that piece is actually relative. Like you can interrogate your system by doing data analytics, but there is an element of having to say, okay, well, actually I need to just look at it and understand it as well. Which can be time consuming, but then once you've done that, you're going to automate it. Like automation is the only way to go, because otherwise you're going to be all grey and, you know, putting in for a hairdo every time you think about it. So I would say to you, like, just think about the data, cleanse it, and then think about the best way for your organization, because it depends on budgets, it depends on long-term plans. I have one client that's an ERP program that they're going to change in 2 years' time, so they're going to actually do something relative, kind of between manual and automated for 2 years, and then they're going to incorporate that in their big change program. But they will have really good data when they get there, because they'll have done it a couple of times, and they're going to be in the first wave of reporting. So lots of things to do, but the data itself, I think, is about just making sure that you kind of understand it and create a platform, and then decide what your investment will be in terms of an actual system.
Mm-hmm. Great. Moving on to another question there while we still have time. So maybe Matt, I'd like to direct this one to you, taking in that sort of capital point of view there. What will be the consequences for organizations who don't report on their sustainability impact properly and who aren't really transparent in this?
I think it depends on size, scale, what type of company you are, but I think the risk is that your cost of capital can go up. It will be seen as a material risk, and therefore your cost of funding could well go up on the back of that. I think also, if it's not reported properly, you know, the way we look at the risk side is potentially your customers might be less confident in giving you contracts or working with you if they can't really verify, you know, your own you know, internal standards, and the reporting will go some way to helping you on that basis. So I think it can seem very daunting for a lot of companies, especially at the smaller side, and therefore it goes back to the point I think we've all actually reiterated. These are standards, and therefore being very aware of what's material to you should be well understood by your supply chain and really help to offset that. But they'd be some of the key risks I would foresee from sort of my perspective, really.
Mm-hmm. Great. And
can
maybe
I just add to that, actually,
of
because
course,
we can't forget that this is a corporate statement and it's going to come into legislation. So it'll be part of your annual report and your kind of statutory reporting requirements. So in due course, if you don't actually do it properly, or you don't meet the requisite standard, there may be consequences as directors of an organization. And I know at the moment, the intention is to bring it in a similar way as you would have any statutory omission. So it's one thing just to think about while it's not necessarily clearly understood what the fine might be, there will be some element of corporate enforcement here in Ireland.
Yeah, so there will be, if you think about it, penalties either which way.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. But that's one that's maybe just interesting from the directors from a legal entity perspective, because obviously there's an investment piece in terms of the business. But if you're signing off a set of financial statements today, there is a fiduciary duty to make sure that the information is comprehensive and complete, as we might know from a recent conversation going on in our news. So it is something that I think everyone will be more alert to. And this reporting will also be covered by that.
Yeah, exactly. Now this question may be slightly more theoretical, opinion based, but how would you see this directive affecting the rest of the world? As in, do you see this EU standard becoming the global standard? You know, because then that really impacts a lot in a positive way, I guess, on the competitive advantages that we would have over here for Irish companies and within the EU compared, you know, to the rest of the globe. I don't know if there's anyone specific who wants to take on that question. Deirdre, maybe.
I'm going to kick off there because this is the reality. I work with a lot of multinationals. Anyone outside of Europe is going, you must be crazy. What are you at? And Europe is saying, well, this is what we want. Anyone operating in Europe must do it, prepare a report on a consolidated basis by 2029 if you're a third-party reporter. Our UK confreres are looking at us thinking, oh, that's interesting. There's aspects that they will take on. I think in all honesty, the International Sustainability Standards Board has also issued their first two standards, which have to be acknowledged and applauded here this morning, because that's a great landmark as of the other day. So there will be divergence. It's not going to be the global, it's going to be I'd say is the global gold star. So we will be producing the best information in Europe. But whether other jurisdictions who are not operating in Europe would want to take on the rigor of the CSRD would be another question. But I do think it will force the agenda and certainly put any company that's complying with it in a driving seat in terms of having good information.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we have time there's one more question here that I'm going to direct towards Laura that we got through the chat box, and it's in relation to biodiversity and how can companies, this is specifically in relation to landscaping companies, or I guess in organizations in general that operate within the realm of biodiversity, how can they tackle that challenge in terms of reporting and capturing the impact that they are having?
Yeah, and I'm not sure for the questioner how large your landscaping company is. It may be that you're not actually going to be in scope for having to report on this for quite a while. But as you say, more generally, for companies that are kind of working in this area, Unfortunately, the more recent changes that came in mean that a lot of the biodiversity standards are not going to be mandatory at this stage. Companies will have an option to disclose around biodiversity or not. Now, I think there's still a huge opportunity here for companies that want to do it, because it's something that people are going to be increasingly interested in. And if you are transparent and you are putting it out there, I think you'll get a lot of credence for that. Your starting point should be a fairly comprehensive biodiversity assessment. And I think the questioner in particular was saying, well, her business has some positive impacts, and that's great. You start off with your biodiversity assessment. When you're reporting around impacts, risks, and opportunities. So you can report on the positive. If you are having an actual net positive effect through what you're doing, that is something that is entirely relevant to report, but it needs to come from a solid baseline of starting point data. So you would need that assessment in place to then report your positive impact from a baseline. But yes, it absolutely gives you an opportunity to tell a good story, and please do, I think, if you can tackle biodiversity, even though it's not mandatory at this stage, you'll be doing everyone a service.
Great, thank you, Laura. We are just about to finish up here. I just want to mention there, Matt also commented on that question in relation to the materiality assessment and the use of a global reporting initiative. He said they also use the SASB materiality framework.
Yeah, it does have the materiality framework. Again, it's another provider. It's just another one to consider. I'm not judging which is better, but just to feed in that's one we've considered. And I'd also say some of the larger companies in sectors that you might be involved in might well be more advanced on their materiality just because they've got the resources. We do check a lot of those for consistency within sectors that we can then relate to other companies within sectors in which we're researching to understand materiality from their point of view, and then obviously it can be quite consistent across sectors. Yeah,
exactly. So there are different opportunities, different frameworks that companies can start to use. It's just a matter of figuring out what is right for your business at the end of the day and how to best tell your story. Okay, everyone, so that went really quickly. So this concludes our Q&A session and the first webinar in this year's Sustainable Cork program. I'd like to thank our speakers very much, Matt Evans, Laura Morrison, and Derica Dennis for taking the time today to join us and share your expert insights into this directive. Thank you so much to our sponsors who provide great support in making the series possible, Cork Chamber Skillnet and ESB Generation and Trading. Thank you very much to Vicky and Lisa on our events team here who provided technical support and helped me in running this webinar. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us today. I hope that you found this session valuable and that you're walking away with some food for thought on how to begin your preparations for this massive transformation. I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you next time for our next webinar in the series, which more information will be out in the coming months. So keep an eye out on corkchamber.ie for more information on upcoming webinars and other events. Thank you again and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Thank you.